Welcome everyone. This is night 3 of our hermeneutics class. Before we get started, I wanted to give you guys a quick update. I printed out this sheet that says putting hermeneutics to practice. This is a bonus activity that after we go through all the steps, this incorporates the bulk of all of them into a format where you can go ahead and pick a passage of your choice, whether it's a chapter or verse, and then kind of run through the process, similar to what you guys did when you took Studying the Bible on Purpose, where you had those study sheets. So this is more or less a study sheet related to hermeneutics. If you guys complete this during class and turn this in with everything else, I'm treating this as an extra credit assignment. So if you guys have the time and want to go ahead and do this in addition to the 8 assignment sheets that match the chapters, then you'll earn yourself some extra credit for this month.
So this has to be done before the end of tonight?
No, it'll be done the normal deadline that the classes have. So not the 16th, but the Thursday after the 16th. So you'll have 2 full weeks from tonight to add it into your assignments if you wish. So that is that. Oh, and next week on the 16th, that's when we're encouraging everybody to go ahead and come to class early around 6 o'clock. If you want to bring a dish or dessert. If you want to bring something to share, we're looking to go ahead and have a mini Christmas party, hang out with everybody, celebrate, the year. And we'll also have some communion that night as well, just to both close out the year and kick off the next year together before our final session of the year. So that is happening next week.
6 o'clock here?
6 o'clock here.
In this room?
It'll probably be the multipurpose room. That way, because all the classes will gather together. Okay. So us and the Studying the Bible on Purpose class.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's it. All right. So we're going to dive straight into historical culture and contextual analysis. So the main theme that this particular process and study within hermeneutics aims to address is determining the author's purpose behind the text that they wrote, or the message that they gave. So to add some meanings to the terms up here, the definitions. So historical cultural analysis, they're 2 sides of one coin. So the historical side, I got ahead of myself. The benefits of historical analysis help us to see the bigger picture surrounding the passage that we're reading. So when you know the history that's going on behind something, that helps add to context, especially when you're studying behavior or the choices people are making. For instance, if someone was studying the behavior of the world, last year in 2020, without knowing the history surrounding some of the changes and policies that went into place because of COVID-19, it would make some of the actions and things that happen confusing for people to know why did suddenly things change. But when they know, oh, this thing happened, and then people started reacting to it, it gives them context for what they're studying. If someone were to do a study on 2020. When it comes to looking for historical facts, some books of the Bible contain those facts within themselves. So especially if you're looking through books that are part of the historical books of the Bible, they tend to mention things that are happening around the same time, or you can look to see what happened just before by looking in that book or one of the other books. And in some cases, it's found from a different book entirely. So when you're looking at the Psalms were written over the spans of hundreds of years and completely different eras of the Old Testament. Some of the Psalms were written during events in Genesis, others in Exodus, across 1 Samuel, across 1 Chronicles, etc. So we have the Psalms together as a collection because they were eventually collected into one huge piece, but the history behind each moment spans multiple different situations and multiple different people. The other side of that coin is the cultural analysis. So the cultural analysis aims to help us understand the behaviors of a specific group or an individual within that group. When it comes to studying the culture of Scripture, it's the same as with historical analysis. Based on the book you're reading, you'll find hints of cultural facts, sometimes within the very passage or the book, and sometimes that will come from another source. If you're actually reading a book on history, a book on culture, commentaries. When it comes to choosing those sources, if you're looking outside the Bible to try to get insight on culture, because again, all of these events, New Testament, most all these events happened over, a few thousand years before we're walking around living and breathing today. So there's a big gap. So when you're consulting sources, the big thing to pay attention to is who wrote them, in terms of, are they qualified to write or speak on the topic that you're seeking them out for. Are they someone who has been studied in this area, who has put in work, who has hands-on knowledge, or are they, your average Wikipedia blogger? It's good to go ahead and know who you're getting it from versus there being a source out there, because we live in the huge information age. So you can find an answer to everything, and when it comes to figuring something out, multiple different views. So you'll want to check your sources to get the best information when you're looking outside the Bible, which there isn't a problem with that, because the Bible in its original context was being written to people who were living in the situations being described. They didn't need what we need because of our time separation. They were in it. So you will at times need to go ahead and look for commentaries or other resources, but just seek God, choose wisely to the best of your ability, and be open to the fact that sometimes some of those details or analysis will be changed down the road as more things are discovered, as practices change. We talked about it a little bit last week, because I think one of you asked the question of whether it seems that things are more accurate or less accurate as time goes on, as we move farther away from the events. And we discussed the fact that it's almost kind of a pendulum, that obviously in the very beginning, being very close to that event, not too much would have changed. And then as years passed, then there was a gap. And then the better our practices get as far as archaeology and uncovering things and resources and understanding how people lived, in a way we're getting better and getting closer knowledge and better knowledge, even though we're still moving further away from the point the event occurred. So then the final piece of this is contextual analysis, which studies the relationship of the given passage to the entire passage surrounding it in order to derive context. So where historical and cultural was looking at the actual physical events being described by the text to look for context, contextual analysis is looking at what is the context based on the other text or other verses or chapters around the one that you're studying. So this one looks to the physical events, this one looks to the written material, each one establishing a meter of context. So, for instance, if you're reading through the book of Galatians or another book, if you were to dive straight into the middle, you may be missing some pieces of information. Galatians 3 will probably make more sense if you've read Galatians chapter 1 and you got to read Paul's intentions behind why he's writing this book, to give you some hints about why he's taking this certain tone or why he's bringing up the certain facts that he is. In a modern day example, if you were to go ahead and pick up a novel off a bookshelf and start reading from the very middle of the book, you can interpret situations very differently. By example, you could go ahead and if it's an action book, you could read a situation where a woman is defending herself from an attacker. She pulls a gun on him, but does not want to shoot. Without any context, the first thing that could come to mind could be, oh, maybe she knows this person, and that's why she doesn't want to shoot. If you jump to the beginning of the book and read all the way through, you'd find out that she's living off the grid because she's hiding from both the law and a different group that's after her. And if she fires her weapon, then that'll lead into investigation and it'll attract attention, which is why she doesn't want to shoot.
What book was that?
When a Secret Kills, part of the Deadly Reunion series by Lynette Eason.
Thank you.
Yeah. A phenomenal series, by the way. A really phenomenal series, by the way. Lynette Eason, this is a brief sidetrack because she is one of my favorite authors and I will advertise her anywhere. Lynette Eason is a Christian fiction author, and she tends to write Christian action / Christian thriller aspects. They are super solid. They're clean, all the way through. But what I love most about it is all of the characters feel real. They don't feel stereotyped. And sometimes I've read certain Christian fiction books where somebody starts monologuing a sermon, mid situation. And while everything that they're saying is right on point and is a great thing to say, that I get derailed a little bit because no one would actually talk that way. That's not real in terms of like how conversations go. But everybody that she develops is incredibly real. When God's stuff gets woven into the books, which they always do in some way, shape, or form, they're spot on, super applicable.
What's the
How
name
do
of
you
the
spell
author?
her name?
Lynettee, Lynette, and then Eason, Eason. That and none of her plots are cookie cutter. There is always at least one or two solid twists. They are 100% original, and they're excellent. If you want a great one just to dive into off the bat, do Elite Guardians. This one's really good too. Deadly Reunions, definitely read that, and definitely read Elite Guardians.
Lead Guardian.
Elite Guardians. Elite. It's a group of it's a private security force of all women who are hired to go ahead and be bodyguards when people's lives are in danger. Yeah, they're cool original ideas. They're awesome. Okay. As I mentioned, commentaries are also very useful for this step as well, because a commentary will typically take into account the chapters and the other verses surrounding what you're reading to give a fuller picture, as well as diving into the specific nuances of the verse or the chapter that you're reading. One of my favorite commentaries that I've discovered over my time here at ECCU is Cornerstone Biblical Commentary by Tyndale. There's multiple volumes that tackle a couple different books at a time. What I like about it is they allow you to read a chapter at a time, and then break out smaller sections with both definitions and then a summary to then talk about things in layman's terms. So it's not so huge to where you're reading some huge chunk of text, and it's also not so narrow to where you're reading a verse and then breaking down from it one verse at a time, because then you could risk losing context. So I like their approach. And they list all their sources very well to where you can check things out yourself. So I highly recommend that.
What was that one again?
Cornerstone Bible Commentary. It's published by Tyndale. Yep. The Old Testament ones are blue and white, and then the New Testament ones are red and white.
Is that Audible?
I don't know if they're Audible or not. I've never looked for it. I don't tend to look for audiobooks because I'm a very hands-on book person. So it's possible, but I wouldn't know offhand.
Some Bible commentaries, though, they will just be aware, I guess. Like for example, John MacArthur.
I guess
I
so,
mean, great. He writes great commentaries, but he's also cessationist. So if you're not, if you believe in the continuous gifts, he
Yep. Some
he's
people's
gonna have that leaning toward that view. So
some people's biases can come through, and what I like about this commentary series as well is that each book has a different lead person. So one person didn't try to sit down and cover the entire Bible as a whole, because there's going to be areas that you're gifted in as far as specializing in your research versus other areas. For instance, I'll be the last person ever to claim that I'm an authority on Revelations and eschatology. I have a basic knowledge of things, but I would never myself go ahead and write a commentary on it. I have not put in the work for that. So when you're looking through these commentaries, each book individually within those volumes is taken up by a different head person with background in that area, which I appreciate. And I've read through multiple of them, and the ones that I've read, mostly for Old Testament, they keep their opinion out of it. They are very quick to go ahead and say if something is a gray area, which I kind of discussed the first and second week, of the fact that is responsible. If you're not sure what something is, to say so.
yeah.
They will mention multiple possibilities for something instead of just one to lean you a certain way.
See, I like that.
if they feel that some options out there don't hold as much evidence, they'll still show us evidence before and, for and against. So they handle things in a very responsible way. So I like it very much. You get a lot of material in your hands for what you pay.
You know if Amazon has that Cornerstone Bible commentary?
I believe so. I got mine of Christian Book Distributors because there was a deal for the price, but I'm very positive they were on Amazon as well because I tend to check things on Amazon frequently. So with that, and if you guys have more questions on that, by all means, let me know. So now we'll jump into the steps for actually performing your own historical, cultural, and contextual analysis. So naturally, one of the first things you'll want to do is to determine the historical factors and the cultural factors concerning both the writer and his audience. Ways you can do that are to determine what the general historical circumstances are. So that means you're thinking about what event is surrounding the text that's being written, what's happening right now, and it's helpful also to consider what happened just before. For instance, if you're looking at 1 Samuel and the fact that Saul is a Benjamite, when he's gone ahead and the people rally around him as king, that's incredibly significant. And the reason is, not too long before, in the book of Judges, which was only within the span of the event could be as little as less than 100 years or only 200 to 300 years before, the tribe of Benjamin got into civil war with the rest of the tribes and was whittled down to 600 survivors because they would not back down. They essentially went to war because they wanted to protect rapists who had attacked a woman. They didn't want to surrender her to justice, so they decided to go to war instead. And neither side backed down from this fight until the tribe of Benjamin was cut down to 600 people from the several thousand members that they had before when they left Egypt. So they're growing back up from this 600. There could easily be a lot of animosity, but you watch the people rally around. To me, that's a sign of God's healing moving through, or just really supernatural favor that God put on Saul when he got started. When you're looking at what happened before you got there as well, in their own history.
What's a good source for finding the historical background? I mean, it's kind of hard to find, really.
For looking at historical background in terms of like events that were happening at the same time, or what do you mean when you say historical?
Well, yeah, what's happening there, like in the day of Paul's writing. I mean, to find specifics, you kind of know the generalities, but to find specifics that...
I mean, to find, when it comes to the New Testament, I'd say some of that is far easier to establish, because for much of what's happening in the New Testament, you can look into those cities, look into what the Roman Empire was doing in each of those years, or what's going on in Greek provinces and different provinces of the like. One of our future courses that you guys will have as students going towards your Bachelor in Theology is New Testament History and Culture, where we specifically go through and walk through and address the history and the culture that overlaps much of the New Testament.
When do we take that?
That course is in May.
Oh, nice.
So you'll get that one as a freebie, with us.
Yeah. I got a book from, what's his name, Vince Arturo. You know him?
Yes.
Yeah. And he's got a Bible history book that's about this wide, about this tall. And he brings it down to the restaurant. We meet. He opens that up. Let's talk about the Romans today. He's really into his history.
That's awesome. That's super fun. So there are at times cultural circumstances that will add meaning to people's actions. For instance, in the story of the prodigal son, for years I read it and there was no significance in my mind to the fact that the father ran to greet his son because I didn't know otherwise. I, as a kid, was reading this through the lens of, our American culture. It wasn't until I was older and then heard preachers and then saw the sources myself to back that up, that in Jewish culture, for a father to go ahead and run to his children himself was taboo at the time that Jesus was giving this example in his parable of the prodigal son. Also, the type of sin that his son committed, for him to return, the village had every right to go ahead and execute punishment on him for how he had dishonored his father. So the father's motivation in running was to go ahead and cover his son's offenses and rescue him and show him mercy, and was willing to do something that would cause embarrassment to himself for the life of his son. That's something that just reading based on our own understanding we wouldn't pick up. But by knowing some of the culture, it changes the meaning. And then a final piece under that first portion is to determine what the spiritual disposition is of the audience. In a nutshell, that's figuring out what is the spiritual outlook that the audience has. What do they believe? So if you're to go ahead and look at the book of Exodus, when Moses comes to bring the Israelites out, each of the plagues and different signs that Moses performs on God's behalf to Israel are all attempts to go ahead and show them God's character and God's might, and to debunk myths that they've adopted, because for 400 years they've been living in Egypt. So their theology has been affected by Egyptian theology. So knowing that, as God is coming to reveal himself and make them and reconfirm that they're his children, in essence, we don't know how well they really know him for who he is at all. So there's things that Moses is introducing and undoing, which adds context to his actions and what he shows them and introduces to them across the books of Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch.
Well, they had to have known some stuff, right, based on what we have read throughout that, when, Moses said, who should I say is coming? And he said, I am who I am, or I am that I am, whichever.
Right. There would have been some things that they knew. Look at what we looked at last week for ourselves when we were looking at the history of biblical interpretation, how there would be a core of things, but influence of the philosophy of the time or culture of the time would suddenly shift how the Bible was interpreted. Living 400 years in Egypt with all of their theology and their politics and their culture was undoubtedly going to influence some of their perspective for as each generation went on how they interpreted their God and the actions of their God.
Kind of like what's happening now here, is that what you're trying to say?
No, I'm saying that there would have been
know.
truths that survived,
Right.
and enough to recognize that God is their God, if they hadn't, adapted any other gods. But when we talked about what certain words mean and how meanings of words can change, and how the meanings of words can change, 400 years is a long time. What they understood about God, and then have 400 years living in another country with all of their culture and beliefs and how they use that very terminology, there would have been adjustments, even though they still believed in Yahweh.
Well, look at just the last 80 years here in our country.
Mm-hmm.
How much has changed, language, different words have meaning. I heard now cap means like
That you're
it's
lying.
a lie or something like that. You guys never heard that?
That's
No.
Yeah.
What?
No, my kids will say that's cap.
Like
I'm
CAP?
Yeah. And I'm like, cap? I'm like, only caps I know is like a hat, or like a bottle cap, no, that means like,
Or
that's
cap
a lie. Like, oh.
Why don't you just say lie?
Or that's lit. I'm like, what? It's lit. Candles, we are lit. No, lit means it's cool.
Mm-hmm.
Or like words now are that actually have a meaning are changing as this culture and generation, right? Like we see it here, and just 80 years ago, you go back, Christianity was
Right, in our country, Christianity was, well, we think, but you have to look at the whole history of everywhere.
yeah.
But it seemed like we were more biblical
Yeah.
Christians, sort
Yeah.
of, depending on where you're looking at. But
Mhm.
today's world just seems so far away
Yeah.
from the Bible.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 80 years ago, how folks go to the beach now, people would go to jail for
Yeah, that's
being
true.
rude or being
Or the
dressed
gym.
inappropriate.
Or the gym,
Or
or
the
even
gym.
walking down the hallways or buildings in
Yeah.
a college.
At school. Yeah, at school.
Oh my
Mhm.
God.
It's ridiculous.
100%.
I know.
Yeah, so it
So-
goes away.
You'll also want to determine the reason that the author had when he wrote the book that he did. When it comes to that, you guys, most of you have had the New Testament survey course in which you got to use the book A Popular Survey of the New Testament, which attempts to go ahead and encapsulate who, what, where, when, why behind each of the New Testament books. The companion book to that, A Popular Survey of the Old Testament, will be used in the course that I teach in February, which is a survey of the Old Testament. Those two books and other books like that are a good little resource to get bits and pieces about the type of people, the audience, why the writer's writing. But most Bibles, especially study Bibles, will also have kind of an intro section that tell you who wrote it, about when it was written, and other basic details like that. Something neat, though, to know is that in some cases, especially for some of the more poetic books of the Bible, sometimes they are dedicated or written for one specific person, but then published for others. So the Song of Solomon is dedicated to a specific Shulamite maiden of the tribe of Issachar, according to Solomon, but then this work was published for the rest of the nation to enjoy. Much in the same way that you can pick up a book, and the first page of a book before you hit the real story will say dedicated to or written for so-and-so, but it's been published for the masses. Same thing with music. A song can be dedicated to a person but released to others. So sometimes some parts of the Bible have that too.
Don't you get the idea that this was translated from another language?
That what, hermeneutics?
Yeah. The book
The book
is
itself.
not, this is not the guy's just not a wordsmith in English.
Well,
That's
for
my
for for me
observation.
for me myself, maybe it's the way that I read. His stuff makes sense to me, and some of the and for me, his stuff makes sense to me, and what I see is someone who is dedicated to choosing the perfect word that he's concise in my mind. So he'll end up picking a word that's perfect to exactly what he's describing, but sometimes that word may be a tad higher than what someone else would go ahead and be
Well,
reading. You know?
Maybe it's academia, that's,
Yeah.
that's what they do. But
Mm-hmm.
it's just sometimes, it's not smooth, it just uses words that seem a little awkward.
Huh? Makes it fun to look up and then go ahead and do some look for yourself. But everything else that's provided in there, especially the exercises. Yeah.
No, no,
I haven't read it
understand
yet,
the
or I'm right there
meaning
with you.
behind it.
Yeah. If yeah. But the exercises that go with it too, go ahead and help break it out. That's part of why, like with the assignments that I've created for the course, is to help you go ahead and get some additional meanings out of some of those bigger words, as well as get to take advantage of the exercises that he provides, which I think are awesome. I actually added a couple to them. I don't know if we'll have time to actually hit on some of these. We'll see based on how the class continues to run. But I pulled some of those exercises from different chapters of the book. So that way, if we have some time, we can actually put some of these things that we're talking about to practice in the class and go ahead and address hypothetical questions that are posed in the book. Okay, so I'll address at this point at the bottom. It's common sense to look for who's the writer and who's he writing to. But something we don't always think about as often is to pay attention to what is explicitly or implicitly stated about their purpose, including what an author chooses to mention or perhaps what they do not mention. Because, especially for books of the Bible that are written by the same person, people have writing patterns. If something is a hot topic and they always talk about it when it occurs, and then there's another situation where it looks like this thing may have happened, but they're silent, then in this gray area, it's still a gray area until we know more truth, but I would lean more toward perhaps that the situation may not have happened, because if this guy always talks about it and he didn't say anything, that'd be out of character for the author, if that makes sense. So, for instance, you guys have a resource here that says facts surrounding Jephthah's infamous vow. This I pulled from the course that I did on the historical books of the Old Testament. Jephthah is a judge from the book of Judges who is known for making a vow when God called him to go ahead and rescue Israel out of a situation. He made a vow telling the Lord that he would go ahead and sacrifice whatever came out of his home first when he got home. When he got back to his property, his daughter raced out to greet him. When you read through the rest of it, he breaks down, and weeps over the fact that he's going to lose his daughter, and explains to his daughter the vow that he made, to which she asks if she can take some friends and go up, into the hills for 3 days, so that way she can mourn her virginity and the fact that she'll never know a man. And after 3 days, she comes back, and it says that the specific text of the Bible just says that Jephthah carried out what he had promised, and his daughter never knew a man. This is typically taken, in the past has been typically taken by scholars to be interpreted that he killed his daughter as a burnt offering sacrifice. When reading the Cornerstone commentary for myself, and it covered that, and then other facts that they pulled on, I compiled it into a handout because they proposed a second opinion on that they felt there were very strong reasons why he actually did not kill her, aside the fact that the Bible never explicitly says that he killed her. The idea, some of the things that they mention, is that a burnt offering had very specific requirements. It never talks about people because human sacrifice is 100% abominable to the Lord, and there's no way he would have accepted it. And second, for it to be that kind of an offering, it would have to be male. She's female. Because God has such a strong, because human sacrifice is so abominable, any other time it happens in Scripture, it is called out fast and it is called out hard, and there is huge punishment and consequences that come down on that action because of how disturbing it is to God. None of that happens here. In fact, the prophet Samuel will go on to reference Jephthah as a role model, and Jephthah is referenced in the chapters in Hebrews 11 with other great members of faith. That would, without any mention of this situation. There was an annual festival that was created in celebration of this event. That would also be extremely odd. What is proposed is that the meanings of some of those words for him to go ahead and sacrifice is similar to the word dedicate. And if you were to dedicate her unto the Lord, unto the temple, under the positions and what they had back then, the position that she had, in order for him to fully dedicate her away from himself, would mean that she would have to remain a virgin until she died, in which that would explain the fact that she's mourning her virginity, and instead of mourning the fact that she's going to be cut up alive and then burned. Right. She doesn't mourn the fact that she's going to get killed. She mourns specifically that she'll be a virgin, always. And for Jephthah, it doesn't change his reaction whatsoever, because part of his mourning is the fact that his legacy will die out. He's an only child who only has a daughter. And if she has to remain a virgin, then his line still ends, whether she's alive or dead. So that doesn't change his reaction. So you'll have a chance to read through some of this evidence put out. But because of those facts that we know from other areas of context of the Bible and what the Bible addresses, and the fact that it's not addressing some things, there's a very good argument put forward for the fact that it doesn't have to be interpreted as that she got killed. In light of looking at the Bible as a whole, and even within that own chapter itself, it actually makes less sense that he killed her than for her to be dedicated like other people are dedicated unto the temple and the Lord's service. So that's an example of that, and that's just a fun resource for you guys to read and go ahead and feel free to dive into yourselves and form, conclusions. That's part of where they go ahead and throw up another opinion of, we can see this here, but let's also consider these points.
There was another human offering that was made that we celebrate annually.
Jesus' death?
Yeah. And so when they say, yeah, that was so boring, to God for a human sacrifice and stuff like that. I mean,
he's listed as the perfect lamb, as
Right.
a substitute,
Yep.
but he's God, and at the same time, he also took on our punishments. So there's a different legal aspect to that of it's if you had someone who was convicted of a felony and then someone else went ahead and substituted themselves to go to jail for that person, you've painted about the same picture. That person goes free and it doesn't bear the same consequence. Well, this person sacrifices their life, their freedom to go ahead and trade places. So I see what you're saying, but I also consider that to be different because God had very strict rules put forth about human sacrifice. Though God says it's abominable to him, he has laws of punishment against it, and they punish and they're constantly told, do not copy these other nations that do this. So that element has to be different, otherwise God would be contradicting his own word.
And to back that up, is that it wasn't a sacrifice, it was a punishment for a criminal's death that Rome had. That wasn't a tradition for sacrifice, like we were saying, for the animals, whereas, and even to also back that up, is that he rose again. So that didn't, I'm losing my words here. Like, you know what I mean.
He wasn't killed by the Romans for a sacrifice,
Right.
but that's what his death was for us.
Right.
Right. He was a substitute, but where there is no gray area is God's own personal many statements that he finds human sacrifice abhorrent and that it is never to be done. So that one, there's no gray area surrounding that specific case. So that's where in my mind I know that the way that that is interpreted, while symbolic and while terminology is used to indicate a sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice on our behalf, it is clearly in a different category because we know God does not contradict himself because he can't. Okay. So these are some questions that help you to determine the meanings of a passage's immediate context. So something you can ask yourself or look at when studying is what are your blocks of material and how are they fitting together as a whole? So if you're looking at a verse, what are the verses surrounding it? If you're looking at a chapter, what are the chapters around it? There is a cycle, so to speak, to Bible study. If you only look at one verse by itself, that could be out of context. You need the big picture around it to add context to the small point. At the same time, if you were to look at the theme of a book as a whole, you would need all the small segments in it to add to the story. So you always need a combination or cycle of the two to get your fullest meaning. Another question that you can consider is how the passage contributes to the flow of the author's argument or to the author's message. The authors of the Bible have a theme going. They're writing something. So if two things don't seem to connect, there may be more exploring to do to figure out, so where did the author see these two as connected that I'm not seeing them as connected? Because they're in a flow here, and there's some things that I've read before where it seems like something rabbit trailed real quick, but it may or may not be a rabbit trail. If you study deep, you could see that the author actually found these three things linked, and we get to discover how. It's also good to consider the perspective and beliefs of the author. So, something that you'll see in the historical books, they're mostly written by prophets who have a very strong black and white view of God and justice and how the world works. So, you won't read situations through a huge lens of grace. It doesn't mean that they're not. It just means that the personal way that the author has their outlook and the way that they write, those things are inferred. They're not explicit. So they're not there. They're just not the main focus of that person for their mission and the way that they write. On the other hand, books that are written by priests and others, there is more of a worship outlook and a grace outlook to the same situations. That's why if you read First and Second Chronicles, written by priests, versus 1st, 2nd Samuel, stories that overlap, can almost read two different ways. They don't truly contradict, but the two situations are described differently because of these two people and the jobs that they perform, which impacts their outlook. And then finally, a good question to ask yourself is if what you're reading is God's perspective or is it a human perspective? For example, Paul, in writing his books, he will differentiate, if you pay attention, between what he's writing that you can tell is God inspired, and at times he will be clear about stating something as being his opinion. So it's good to know in cases that are his opinion, this is the opinion of Paul, who has wisdom, but he will also state that some things are his opinion, where other things are clearly what he is putting forth as instructions to follow, as opposed to suggestions. And I think we'll go ahead and go through this one also before we wrap up. So, wrapping up our other steps, you'll also want to distinguish between what is descriptive or prescriptive truth. This is similar to the last point. So, a descriptive truth are basically facts being described. Prescriptive truth is a term for what's being put forth to you as gospel, so to speak, as things that you should copy as the truth or spiritual truth of God, because both are present, and not everything in the Bible is prescriptive. Some of it's just descriptive. For example, the Pharisees accused Jesus of being empowered by demons, and that's how he performs his miracles. That is a descriptive truth. Factually, that is what they believed, and that is what they accused him of. That is not a prescriptive truth. That's not the spiritual truth. We know that Jesus did not actually operate by the power of demons. We know that he's the Son of God. So if you were to pull that verse you would need to know that just because a figure in the Bible says something historically, that does not make it a prescriptive truth. It means it's factual, that they said or believed it. It's not the same as prescriptive. You'll want to look to other books of the Bible to see if that belief is backed up. You'll also want to see what constitutes the teaching focus of the package and what represents incidental detail only. So an example of this, if you're in John 15, Jesus Christ is called the vine. We know that the author is aiming for a particular symbol of the fact that we are grafted in and connected to Jesus. Almost another type of symbol for when Jesus says that, that we are his body. And other apostles and writers will go ahead and talk about the body of Christ. It's a similar symbol to that. That we know the author is aiming for. You could look at incidental details in which you could reason to yourself, well, vines are plants, and plants were created by God, so Jesus must be a created being, because they said Jesus was a vine. At that point, you've started to look at coincidental details, and you've pulled it away from what the author's even focusing on, and you've changed facts. Again, being able to look at other areas of the Bible, because the Bible is consistent, you can look toward other of the same topics to back up what you're reading. And then finally, you'll look to identify the person or category of persons for whom the particular passage was intended. Another way of saying looking for the audience, but that impacts how people are receiving things. For instance, in the New Covenant, in the era in which we continue to live under today, the rituals that are given in Leviticus, and I say rituals specifically, meaning the practices, pretty much all the rituals do not carry over. But the principles that they're meant to symbolize and the lessons being taught through them are carried over into the New Testament and reiterated in the same or different way. Sometimes the stakes are even raised in the same lessons. So truths carry over, but not every ritual or practice carries over. But the principles behind them stay consistent between the two. So knowing where you're studying helps you to understand where those two are different. Any thoughts or questions on any of this stuff? Any of this stuff. Alrighty, then we will go ahead and take our first break here.